our last lesson, we looked at the factors that led the English to establish colonies in the New World. And in today's lesson, we're going to look at the establishment of the first colonies in the New World by the English. Now, between 1585 and 1620, the English made 3 attempts to establish colonies along the Atlantic seaboard. Roanoke, Jamestown, and finally Plymouth. And 2 of these 3 efforts were successful and resulted in successful colonies. And a lot of the success of the colonists is due to the tenacity and the determination of the colonists and just a lot of just good luck and the fact that they could count on their investors back home to support them. So first of all, let's talk about why they made the Atlantic seaboard the place where they were going to establish their first colonies. Now, as soon as the New World had been discovered, not soon after Columbus's voyage, English fishermen and Irish and Scotch fishermen were already arriving off the coast of Newfoundland and New England in search of fishery. And so already by the mid to late 16th century, the English were becoming very familiar with this coastline. Now, a major reason why this area was colonized was because the Spanish had failed to establish colonies or outposts in this region. Now, the failure, it wasn't really a failure, but it was a conscious decision by the Spaniards not to establish colonies north of Mexico. And this decision was made largely on the experiences of 2 conquistadors, 2 great explorers, Hernando de Soto and Francisco Coronado. Now, de Soto was a conquistador who explored what today would be the American Southeast. Florida, Mississippi, Tennessee, Georgia. Coronado, around the same time in the 1630s, 1640s, he explored what would be today the American Southwest in New Mexico and Arizona. And what these 2 conquistadors found was that there were no great empires, no gold, no silver, and instead just a bunch of very hostile, warlike tribes who fought them tooth and nail everywhere they went. So the Spanish decided that given the effort that would be involved and the high cost and the scanty benefits, that establishing colonies and further exploration of the area north of Mexico was unnecessary. The Spanish would only really establish 2 major outposts in the 17th century, 16th and 17th century in the New World. St. Augustine in Florida was established in 1565 basically because French Protestant pirates had established a colony in Florida for the purpose of attacking Spanish ships bringing gold to Europe. So St. Augustine was basically established to protect sea routes and fight off pirates. Eventually the Spanish did establish missions and outposts in Florida, and for a short time in the 16th century they extended their missions and outposts further north into Georgia and even into the Carolinas. But in the Carolinas and in Georgia, these missions and outposts were shortly thereafter abandoned. The only other area that the Spanish colonized in the 17th century was the Rio Grande River, mainly to protect northern Mexico from incursions from tribes north of the Rio Grande. So Santa Fe in modern New Mexico was and founded in 1609, was one of the first settlements other than St. Augustine to be established by the Spanish in what was today the United States. So basically the Spanish were not there, and that left a vacuum, and the English were quick to fill that vacuum, and they saw the Atlantic seaboard, because of their familiarity with the region and the fact that the Spanish weren't there, they saw that as an opportunity to establish colonies. So let's look at the first attempt, and that would be at Roanoke. Now, Roanoke came about as a result of the work of 2 English aristocrats, Walter Raleigh and his half-brother Humphrey Gilbert. Now, they were members of the court of Queen Elizabeth, and they were also good friends and colleagues of many English privateers or pirates who were the sea dogs attacking Spanish ships. And since Humphrey Gilbert and Sir Walter Raleigh were fighting the Spanish and were pirates, they really saw that the need for bases, for seeing the New World as a place, as an operation to attack the Spanish and to get back at the Spanish. So thanks to their efforts, Queen Elizabeth initially granted a patent or a right to establish a colony to the older brother, Sir Humphrey Gilbert, in 1578. Humphrey Gilbert actually ended up exploring what would today be Newfoundland, and in 1583 he disappeared. To this day, we really don't know what happened to Sir Humphrey Gilbert. So as a result, Queen Elizabeth transferred the right to establish a colony to his half-brother, his younger half-brother, Walter Raleigh. And now Walter Raleigh decided that, based on news reports that he had heard, that Newfoundland was just too cold. So he had a plan to establish a colony further south, and if you look on, and this area was much south, further south, and he decided to name the country Virginia in honor of Queen Elizabeth, who was known as the Virgin Queen by the fact that she never married. Now, to pay for the establishment of a colony, Raleigh relied on funds that he got from pirates. As pirates, English privateers attacked Spanish ships, that money was used to finance the establishment of a colony. Now, Raleigh got all of his ducks in order, and he established the first colony on Roanoke Island. Now, Roanoke Island was in the land generally known as Virginia, but it's actually off the north coast of North Carolina. And he established this colony in 1585. Now, the settlers that he established were all soldiers of fortune. Now, they didn't stay there that long. They heard reports that the Spanish were planning an attack, so they got on their ships and left. And so the first attempt didn't work, but Raleigh was determined. So in 1587, he brought in 117 settlers. And this was a settlement that wasn't just soldiers, but it included women and children. In fact, in 1587, the first English person to be born in the New World was born, Virginia Dare. This was supposed to be a colony that would be not just soldiers of fortune, but all people. Now, Walter Raleigh departed after establishing the colony, and in the years that followed, the colony got lost. You know, that we had the Spanish Armada was going on, and England itself was under attack. So it wasn't until 1590 that Walter Raleigh returned to Roanoke, and what he found was that the colony had completely disappeared. And to this day, the Roanoke colony is called the Lost Colony. Now, we don't know what happened to them. One theory is they were all killed by local Indians. Maybe perhaps they went to live with the Indians. It's a mystery. But one thing that Walter Raleigh did was that he generated a lot of interest in establishing a colony in Virginia. In fact, a good friend of his by the name of Richard Hakluyt published a very popular pamphlet that made the rounds in England. And what this pamphlet did was to make the case for establishing a colony, an English colony in the New World. And these reasons would be factors that would lead people to be interested in future investment. Like, he argued that establishing a colony would bring Protestant Christianity to the heathen of the New World. He argued that colonies would provide England with raw materials to benefit its economy. He argued that new colonies would serve as a market for English-made goods. And also he argued that in this pamphlet that the English poor could find new homes and a new start in the New World. And finally, it was in this pamphlet it was maintained that eventually colonies would lead to the discovery of the Northwest Passage that would provide a direct sea route to the riches of the Far East. So Walter Raleigh's efforts were very important in generating a lot of excitement and interest in the New World and establishing colonies. Another thing that Walter Raleigh did was that he popularized smoking tobacco. And as we'll see, that would be important in the future success of Virginia. Now, because of Raleigh's efforts, in 1606, a group of investors, these would be merchants and landowners who had money to invest, they decided to establish a joint stock company. They came from the ports of Plymouth and they came from London, and they received a charter from the King James I to establish a colony. And this Virginia company was given a charter to establish this colony in Virginia. And now in those days, Virginia, when it was first, the charter was made, Virginia included the entire Atlantic coast. And so in 1607, after they had raised money, actually 2 colonies were established along the Atlantic seaboard. One up in Maine, along the Kennebec River, and then the other in the Chesapeake Bay in what is today Virginia. Now, the northern colony, the one up in Maine, it didn't last very long. The one in Maine suffered from attacks by Indians and from disease, and by the end of 1607, it was gone. The Jamestown colony suffered from disease and Indian attacks, and it probably would have completely failed if it had not been for the efforts of for John Smith. John Smith assumed, he was one of the initial settlers, and he assumed command of the colony. He was chosen president in 1608, primarily because all the other people appointed by the Virginia Company to run the colony were dead. So by default, he became leader of the colony, and since he had experience as a general, he pretty much ran the camp just like a military camp. He also was able to keep the colony under control. He was able, through his efforts, his diplomatic efforts, he was able to win the friendship of King Powhatan, the local Indian leader. And a lot of his success with Powhatan came through Powhatan's daughter, the famous Pocahontas. And through his diplomatic efforts, he was able to secure peace for a time with the Indians. Now, unfortunately, though, in 1609, John Smith had an accident, and he had to leave the colony to seek medical attention. And when he left, though, the Virginia Company sent 400 more colonists to Jamestown. And unfortunately, when these 400 colonists arrived, the leader of the colony, the new leader appointed by the Virginia Company, Thomas West, Lord Delaware, his ship was shipwrecked on the island of Bermuda. So these 400 colonists arrived without a lot of new supplies and without any leadership. And the fact that Smith was gone and all these new settlers arrived with no leadership and without supplies, this created a terrible situation. And from 1699 to 1610, it looked like the colony wasn't going to make it. The Indian relations with the Indians broke down, disease and starvation took their toll, and by early 1610, only 60 people were left. Now, it was at this point that, fortunately, Thomas West, his supply ships were rebuilt, and they sailed from Bermuda, and they landed in 1610 with fresh supplies and new leadership, and just by the skin of its teeth, the colony survived. Now, Thomas West, following the example of John Smith, he ran the colony like a military camp. But in 1618, the Virginia Company decided to put into effect a new idea. And the idea was, it's called the headright system. They decided that they were going to, beginning in 1618, that they were going to make a series of land grants to investors. And any investor who was able to bring laborers to the colony would get 50 acres of land for every laborer they brought. Now, one of the reasons why they instituted this new policy was because by 1618 it was clear that the Virginia colony could be profitable because of tobacco production. Remember, there was a big demand for tobacco because of Walter Raleigh. And just a couple of years before this, in 1616, a Jamestown colonist by the name of John Rolfe had introduced West Indies tobacco to Virginia. And the crop just flourished in the Virginia soil. So the purpose of the headright system was to bring laborers and bring landowners to grow tobacco in the colony. Now, thanks to this new policy, thousands upon thousands of new people arrived in the colony. And many of the laborers who came as indentured servants. In fact, in 1619, some 4,500 new settlers arrived in Virginia. Now, the colony thrived and grew, and eventually this created problems. In 1622, Powhatan's younger brother, Opechancanough, he succeeded his brother as ruler, and he was not happy with the rapid growth of the colony, and he started a war. And this war was very disruptive and very destructive of life and property. And by 1624, the colony, the Virginia Company, was bankrupt. And James I, saying that the colony was bankrupt, he engineered I guess would be the first bailout in American history. The English government took direct control of the Virginia colony, and it became the Royal Colony of Virginia in 1624. And in a royal colony, the governor was appointed by the king, by the crown. So that's Jamestown. We've talked about Roanoke. Now let's talk about the last, this successful colony at Plymouth. Now the Pilgrims, as they're known, who established the colony at Plymouth, were English separatists. And originally they had left England because of persecution and settled in the Netherlands, among the Dutch. But what they found was that even though they enjoyed religious freedom in the Netherlands, they didn't like the fact that their children were becoming assimilated to the Dutch. They were very proud of their English heritage. So what happened is that they learned that the Virginia Company was offering land to anybody who brought people and laborers to Virginia. So in 1619, they struck a deal with the Virginia Company that would allow them to come to Virginia and settle in the New World. And in fact, they got a group of investors from the town of Plymouth, that's how it got its name. A group of investors, of merchants from Plymouth, agreed to finance the voyage, to finance the expedition. So in 1620, 101 colonists, 87 of whom were Pilgrims, they got onto the ship, the Mayflower, and sailed to the New World, to what they thought would be Virginia. Now, if you look at the colonies, you can see that they didn't get to Virginia. Instead, they sailed to what would today be Cape Cod in Massachusetts. And as soon as they got there, they realized that they were not where they were supposed to be. But they were tired. They'd been on a ship for 3 months. They were ready to just get off that ship. So they decided to stay put and establish a colony in the Plymouth colony in what is today Massachusetts. Now, the colony probably wouldn't have made it, but it survived thanks to the aid of an English-speaking Indian named Squanto. It is believed that this Squanto had been kidnapped by pirates and learned English somehow, but he walked into the settlement and he made the Pilgrims familiar with the environment, taught them how to grow corn, where to find food, and even the Pilgrims acknowledged that Squanto was a blessing from God, that his help had been one of the major reasons they had succeeded. Also, they were able to win the alliance of the local sachem or king of the Massasoit, who were the more powerful tribe. Massasoit was the king, but the tribe was the Wampanoag tribe. And they befriended the Pilgrims. It is believed that the Wampanoag tribe had suffered from epidemic diseases, and many historians believe that they saw an alliance with the Pilgrims as a way to help defend them against their more unfriendly neighbors. Now, the colony really thrived, and a lot of its growth was due to the determination of the Pilgrims, their determination to live in peace and to thrive and to practice their religion. But the colony, even though it grew rapidly in size due to a high birth rate, it was never a financial success. In fact, the Plymouth Company that had financed the expedition, it went bankrupt in 1626. Now, from the very beginning, one of the sources of success for the colony was the fact that it was well governed. In 1620, when the expedition was still on the Mayflower, all the people involved signed the Mayflower Compact. And it was a covenant, it was an agreement among all the adult males, all the freeholders as they were called. And what they agreed to was to elect a governor, and they would elect the governor, and they would obey the governor. And from that point onward, all the adult male members who were members of the church were made up the general court that had to make laws and taxes for the colony. And they also elected a governor. The governor was a man by the name of William Bradford. He was such a popular governor, he was elected for 30 consecutive terms. I don't think any politician today would have that kind of success. But thanks to Bradford's leadership and the fact that they were organized, the colony really just thrived and took off. And the freeholders, the adult males in the colony, they made up the general court or colonial legislature for the colony. Now, the Plymouth colony had received a patent after the fact by James I in 1621. And the colony continued to exist till 1691. And unfortunately, the colony came to an end because its relationship with the Wampanoag tribe deteriorated. There was a warfare broke out between the Plymouth colony and the Wampanoags in a war called King Philip's War in 1676. King Philip, also known as Metacomet, was the son of Massasoit, and he rejected his Christian faith that he had been baptized into, and became the leader of the Wampanoags, and he formed an alliance of neighboring tribes to wage war not only against the Plymouth tribe but against all the New England colonies. And his goal was to throw them into the sea and completely crush them. Now, Metacomet, eventually his war came to an end. Metacomet was assassinated, and within a number of years the war came to an end, and the Wampanoag tribe was almost entirely eliminated. But the Plymouth colony had taken such a toll, it had lost so much population and property as a result of the war, that in 1691 it was combined with the neighboring Massachusetts Bay colony to form the Royal Colony of Massachusetts. So that's how the colony came to an end. So we've talked about the different colony, the first efforts to establish colonies. In the next lesson, we're going to look at how in the different regions of the colonies distinct cultural developments occurred and distinct cultures developed. And that will be the subject of our next lesson.